Thank you all for joining today. Well, Anika started out suggesting or saying she's a leadership coach, and I also have been an executive coach for the last 25 years. And it's great because I never got bored with it. There was always something new to learn, and the environment kept changing. So it really kept me very interested. And my focus over that period of time was really working to make some of the intangible aspects of being a successful leader more tangible for people. When you're in the lower levels of leadership, there's more specific behaviors and actions and approaches you can take. And as you go up the ranks, it starts to be this very nebulous thing about, wait, what separates a decent leader from an exceptional leader? So today we're going to talk a little bit about going beyond skills and developing capacity as a means for a more in-depth, impactful form of leadership development. And I'll just start a bit with my own story. So I've been a coach for a long time. I coached a lot of execs and C-suites, and I actually started my coaching career in the early 90s, right at the advent of the coaching profession. I actually think I was certified 1 year before the ICF was originated. So have seen that whole profession of coaching and from a leadership development perspective over that time frame. And one thing that the folks at the top of the house kept telling me all along was, I wish I had this earlier in my career. And in 2016, a previous client of mine called and said, coaching, leadership coaching, executive coaching was the best leader development I've had in my entire career. And she worked at Google and YouTube and a few other places as well. And she said, I want to bring this to more leaders in the organization. So we teamed up together to create Sounding Board. And in 2018, we launched our adaptive software and our people-to-people development through leadership coaching. We have a behavioral science background where we help shape the dynamic leaders needed to thrive in today's turbulent global market. Our award-winning SaaS technology delivers unparalleled flexibility, and our powerhouse roster of world-class leadership coaches, Monica, you should think about joining us, leverages decades of leadership and coaching experience to accelerate the development of leaders at all levels. So today we're going to talk about a few areas. So really just that this is a time for a big change in how leaders are developed. It's really an opportunity for a leadership revolution. And one of the reasons for that is just the environment has changed so dramatically since the last century. And now we need to really leverage both skills and capacity to meet the increasingly complex and rapid demands of the work world today. And we're hoping that our approach to all of this will drive organizational change by really finding an optimal balance between what we're going to talk about in terms of vertical and horizontal development. And we'll explain both of those and how they work together. And the idea is to create really a pipeline of leaders who are ready to take on these sort of unknown, diverse, and unpredictable challenges that are currently facing leaders in our work world today. So there you go. We're going to just talk about a VUCA world. That term has been around really since probably the 90s, but certainly the 2000s. But I feel like since, maybe March 2020, it's just accelerated fairly dramatically. And with the pandemics, with a dramatic change in location of work, with the economic situations and how that is not similar to times in the past. And of course, with unpredictable changes such as Chat GPT, AI, there's a lot going on that's creating a pretty crazy environment for our leaders today. And you might know for yourself that when you're facing the unknown, it's naturally a kind of a fear-based reaction you can have. And from that fear-based reaction, there's a tendency to try to control things like, whoa, everything feels out of control. So you end up, as a kind of human nature, doubling down on trying to control things. And we're going to suggest that that's no longer very effective. And what we need to do now is we need to help people to adapt to the changes that are happening and help them do that more rapidly and with less stress and more ease than in the past. So I know I've noticed a lot of change since I started in the coaching profession in the 90s, and that it's accelerated over the last couple of years. We want to ask you all, what changes have you noticed in terms of learning and development, just the work environment over that period of time? And somebody is probably going to tell you, but you can put your answers in the poll there. There we go. So we're starting to get a few answers in. Yeah, increased focus on ROI in terms of L&D initiatives. Like, yeah, people just don't want to spend money. They want to make sure they're getting some outcome and impact for their funds. Leveraging technology, not only to make it more interactive, but just to be able to automate and distribute that learning in a wider way. Leaders do not know the basics of leadership. Yeah, that's interesting.
What are your thoughts about the response that was coming in that said they have to do a lot of it on their own? What are your thoughts on that?
Meaning as an individual employee?
I would imagine that would mean as an individual and employee, they're having to find their own learning and development.
Yeah, I actually think that's really true. So one of the biggest changes that's happened, say, over the last 30, 40 years is, I've been around the block a few times. When I started my career, large enterprise hired people right out of schooling and kept them until they retired. And their point of view was this bit of it in loco parentis view, where they felt like it was their responsibility to develop people and to develop their employees through their career. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, that really shifted. Companies don't hold employees for their entire career so much anymore. And with that change came this idea that employees are now responsible for their own career development. And as many of you probably suggesting, that hasn't worked out all that great. So I think it is the pendulum's starting to swing back a bit, so that there's more like a joint responsibility between the organization and the employee for the employee's development. And then another factor in there is just how rapidly employees need to develop their skills, not just because of changing environment, but also because if you're going to be working at one company for 20 years, you had 20-year development trajectory. Now the average tenure at companies is less than 5 years. I think it's between 3 and 4 years at the moment. And so that acceleration of developmental needs is pretty profound at this moment. Just seeing so many things here in the chat. Clearly, there's a lot going on. So we're going to start to narrow in on this idea of skills and capacity and horizontal and vertical development. But just as a preface for that, here was kind of some of our ideas of how things have changed over the last period of time. So that difference in how long employees are staying with a company. I saw a lot of people mentioning DEI initiatives and just a much more diverse workplace than in the past. You know, the work location in office only versus in office, hybrid, remote, you know, probably some other ways people have dreamed up. The number of generations in the workplace as well leads to the diversity around needs. And then specifically around women in the workplace. Although there's still only 53 women CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, that's 10%. That's way higher than in the past. It's still obviously abysmally low. So there's still a lot of work to do there. So we're going to suggest that in the current work environment, we really need a way to build leaders that can respond more dynamically to the changes going on. And everyone's familiar with skill development. We've been doing that for years. I actually started my career started my career as a social worker, but eventually, after some additional education, got into training and development. And spent years teaching soft skills, leadership skills, really in the training environment of the time, which was in-person groups that sometimes met for up to 5 days at a time. It's almost hard to even comprehend. We used to do that now with the push towards online learning and bite-sized learning and that kind of thing. But that's how it used to be. And the thing all that skill development, it's fantastic. As someone was pointing out, people don't have the basic skills for leadership. So we really need to still continue that development of primary skills. But I'm going to suggest there's another area of development that we are calling capacity. So the way I kind of define it is skills are individual sets of behaviors, competencies, tools, approaches people can use. A capability is then a blend of a couple of types of tools or skills together. And then capacity is then your ability to actually apply those skills and tools appropriately in the context of your organization, in the context of whatever change is going on in the moment, and to do that successfully. And what that means is those skills are not going to be applied in the same way every day going forward like they may have been in the past. And, you know, in my training and development career, one of the things that I always got asked in the training room, like, yeah, these skills are great, but how do I actually use this? And if anybody out there is as old as I am, you'll remember those days when everybody had these binders of their training courses lined up on a shelf in their office. And we always knew, like, once the training was done, those binders went up on the shelf, and it was really a lot of work to get people to take those binders down and try to apply what we had spent the 2, 3, 4, 5 days teaching them. So we're going to talk about not just skills, but really the application of those skills. So let's take it apart a little bit. Mary, you can go on to the next slide. So what do we mean by horizontal and vertical development? So horizontal being the acquisition of new knowledge, information, or skills. And generally, these are more tangible items that can be taught more generally. These are the sets of things that everybody in that job needs to know, and it helps them get things done in their job. The vertical development is the more intangible part of this equation. It's more complex and sophisticated. So how do you actually apply those skills that you've learned really even across your entire career so that they are situationally effective? And that means you can't apply them in the same way in every given situation. It requires more of a choice and a decision around what's needed in this particular context or situation. So that was kind of the secret sauce that made the difference between a decent leader and exceptional leader. There was this intangible way that they were able to adapt and apply their skills in a way that worked in lots of different situations instead of in one. And we used to use that little phrase like, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you're applying a hammer to every situation, and whether that's a nail or that's a glass window, you're going to have a different impact on the application of those skills. So here's a little bit more about the horizontal development. It's kind of the outside in learning. You're taking in knowledge from the outside. And because of that, it tends to be more in the things to do category, behaviors, models, that kind of thing. And these can be really useful when the environment is more predictable, and a little harder when the environment is unpredictable. And then these are also the more tangible parts of a leader's work. The vertical development is more intangible. It's the things that are changing inside your head that are allowing you to apply your skills in a variety of different ways. It's more of a being thing than a doing thing because it requires observational skills. It requires self-assessment skills. It requires the ability to assess in the moment a certain situation and kind of file through all those tools you have in your toolbox and choose the ones that are appropriate for that particular circumstances. And the reason it's been pretty intangible is because it's like happening inside the leader. So how do you impact that? Like just learning from the outside doesn't necessarily change the way people are thinking and operating on the inside. So we need something a little more to make that happen. And here's kind of just to give you an idea of the difference of the horizontal development and vertical development, the application. So you can just see the horizontal skill development is just almost like more practical, more tactical. And the vertical development is really about all the different circumstances that a leader is facing. What's really nice is these two forms of development blend together to make a more comprehensive approach to leader development. So the skill approach is a little more on the transactional side. It's binary. You have it or you don't have it. You completed the training course or you didn't complete it. You have the testable skill or you don't have a testable skill. And outcome focused in the sense that it helps you be more successful at your specific job tasks, let's say. The vertical development is the more intangible development. It's about applying your skills in complex situations. It requires some internal capacities to be able to apply those skills appropriately. So there has to be a sense of self-awareness. There has to be some observational skills. Sometimes when we say maturity or sophistication, what that really means is just being able to step back a little bit out of the situation and view it less personally, and in a larger picture framework, so that you're able to see a broader picture of what's happening. And then that's going to allow you to apply skills in a more successful manner. And yes, of course, we always like outcome, but we also, in this case, want impact. So the impact of the application of those skills are equally important to whatever results, because that impact is a form of that outcome. Like, if you've had the experience where an organization gets, say, the numbers they want, but in the meantime, they disengage the employees in the organization, then you can see the difference between impact and outcome. And you really need both of those. That vertical development also needs to be applied to address some of the common issues that we're experiencing in the workplace, because some of those issues are not tactical issues. Some of the issues around diversity or sense of purpose or connection or identity, those are actually vertical problems in an organization. Whether we met our, a quota or we met our KPIs, those are more of the tactical kinds of things that are more easily measurable in an organization. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, why you need both of these to be operating together. Now you can go on to the next. Oh, wait a minute, Monica.
Lori, we have a couple of questions that are coming in for you.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is from Kristen, who wants to know, do you have a core set of skills or competencies that you believe a leader should have? And if so, do you have a way to assess that?
And do we have I didn't hear the very last part. Do we have
a way to assess it?
Oh, yes. Okay, good. We do have a set of what we call capacities. And we have accumulated that over time, it's an aggregated set of the most requested capacities. But the way we work at Sounding Board is we know that organizations have also created their own sets of capacities or leadership philosophies. So what we do is customizable to that. If you don't have that, we can provide it for you. If you have that, then we coach and develop right to the set of capacities you all have. So really it's both. Measurement is very interesting. And I would say on that side, we're still in the middle of figuring that out. We have identified, in addition to capabilities, a set of capacities that we are finding create that difference between a good and a great leader. And those are hard to measure, right? Because if they're intangible, there's not a numeric measurement for them. So we have to measure those around the actual application, and that means getting feedback from others. But that feedback can't be the same way we've done 360 feedback for the last 30 or 40 years. Because again, that is measuring what can be seen and heard. It's not measuring what's happening inside the leader that's allowing them to be successful. So I'll say this, it's a work in progress, but that's where we're heading, so that we're starting to use the base. It's always sort of like that standing on the shoulders of giants. We're using the base of things that have been developed in the last century, but we have to adapt them and modify them and expand them for what's happening in this century in the current work environment.
Thanks for that, Lori. And it looks like the next question for you, it kind of relates to what you were just speaking to. Kelly would like to know, What kinds of resources have you seen as effective to offer leaders to build their vertical development?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give a plug for coaching later because we know that it's one of the top tools for that kind of development. But in addition to that, I think mentoring is also a pretty good tool for that. And not because the mentor can tell an individual how to do that, but the mentoring conversation can kind of get inside of the head of the mentor and try to like pull out how they think about things, which then gives a little insight into this vertical development. A third place that we're also experimenting with that I'm a big fan of is a change in the way we do performance management. And we have been experimenting with Sounding Board, shifting that conversation instead of being specifically about performance to be about alignment so that the manager and the employee are jointly responsible for the employee's success. And for the employee to be successful, there has to be like a meeting of the minds between the manager and the employee, and then having some tools to try to assess, how much in alignment the manager and the employee are. So we actually haven't rolled this out as a project, but we experiment inside our own company. And we did that this year and found using a gap analysis around the thinking of the manager and the thinking of the employee created some very, very productive conversations for those folks. And shockingly, you'll all be shocked to know that people were not hating the performance management process. They actually found these conversations to be very interesting and useful. So you'll probably hear more about that from us a little bit later. So we're starting to adapt some old ways into some new ways that we hope is going to get a little more to this internal thinking of folks and make that a little more visible. Now you can see this slide here about how horizontal and vertical development work together. So one thing I do on the side is I have a long-term practice of the martial art Tai Chi Chuan. So if you don't know, Tai Chi is that kind of calisthenics format that older people do in the park. That approach also has a martial side of it, and that's what I do as well. So there's the solo part of it, and then there's the interactive or sparring part of it. And that's a long-term development. So I've been actually doing it more than 30 years. I kind of gave this developmental idea both from my leadership practice and from my Tai Chi practice, which is if you have two axes here, you have your horizontal axis on the bottom and your vertical axis is going up the sides. If you keep expanding your practice of your core sets of skills and you keep expanding your application of those skills, you have the opportunity for continuous evolution or development. But notice if either side stops, and for those folks who are very much into skill development, if skill development stops, you hit the peak of your triangle. So what you're looking for is the place where you never hit the peak, that there's always expansion on the horizontal level, and there's always expansion on the vertical level. And now you have the opportunity to have employees and leaders who are continually expanding themselves and not getting stagnant or stuck or using the same old thing over and over again. And as you get up into the higher leadership ranks, you start to hit on the teaching old dog new tricks kinds of things. And sometimes that means going back to some basic skill development that maybe is operating very differently now than it did 20, 30, 40 years ago. So I like this model so that we're constantly thinking about development. It's not a point in time, once a year or programmatic approach. It's actually a continuous, ongoing approach to development. Let's see. Do I want to say anything else about that? No, I think that's good. So the goal of all of this, obviously, is to start bridging some of the leadership gaps that we are experiencing these days. And the gaps, there's a number of them, and they are pretty wide as well in a lot of cases. So before we talk about that, I wanted to check in with you all and see, in your organizations, what leadership gaps are you facing? Yeah, give you a couple of moments here to type in. Yeah, so we got talent gaps, really replacing qualified leaders, and boy, the time frame to actually find and hire those leaders is expanding, I think. What other kinds of gaps are people facing? Yep, okay. Building a more transactional leader or transformational leader versus transactional, succession planning, soft skills, emotional awareness, self-awareness, generational differences, communication. Yep. No new skills. They've been at the organization too long. Okay, interesting. Oh, the manager's not willing to have difficult conversations. If some of you, I'm sure, have been around, we've been teaching how to have a difficult conversation for 30 years, and it really hasn't gotten very much easier. Oh, and having coaching as a punitive approach. Oh my gosh, I'll say something quickly about that. In the coaching industry, in the early days, coaching was like a hidden thing behind closed doors. And one of the reasons was some of the early visible coaching was for, quote, derailed leaders. And of course, no one wanted to be considered a derailed leader. So they didn't want anyone to know they had a coach, because that would just tell the world that they were off track. That kind of evolved almost into this punitive thing where people were coaching employees out of the organization. That is not the form of coaching that we are talking about. We are talking about developmental coaching as a developmental tool, not as a way to give feedback, critical feedback, not as a way to save derailed executives, not as a way to manage people out of the business. So I do think there's still some work to do in understanding, clarifying the purposes of coaching. Okay, good. We got a lot of items here. So let's we made like a little summary slide of some of the things that we're thinking are the gaps. So yeah, basically a weak leadership bench. So a lot of people talking about either not being able to hire in skilled leaders, not having people there for succession planning. I think they're not having people there for promotional purposes. You might even develop people well, and then they leave before they have the opportunity to be promoted. Obviously, inclusion issues. We have heard over and over that leaders are lacking a strategic view, that they are too focused on getting things done in the moment and not focused enough on how those momentary items fit into a larger picture. Yeah, as always, the soft skills always need help. Talent attraction and retention, it's starting to be the place where people if they don't feel like they're being developed or getting development, they will leave the organization and move over to someplace where they do have access for that. Another is just the old problem of siloed departments. So when you have skillful leaders, they know the organization has to work together to achieve its goals. And so there's a lot more cross-functional engagement. And then the last one, the big adaptability. So one of the interesting things about trying to close these gaps is a lot of times companies will use horizontal development to try to solve vertical problems. So some of these problems around inclusion or talent or adaptability, those are actually vertical problems. And so they need vertical solutions. And no matter how many horizontal solutions you try to apply, it actually won't have impact. On the other side, things like developing capabilities, developing strategic thinking, some of those are more horizontal issues that then can be addressed by a horizontal approach. So one of the key learnings is that you have to identify the gap that you're trying to close. You know, is it a horizontal or is it a vertical gap? And then make sure that the solution that you're applying to that is matching the source of the problem. And there's an interesting study from McKinsey, and they said employees were far more likely to prioritize relational factors, including feeling valued by their manager and organization and having a sense of connection, which is a vertical situation, in contrast to the employers who are more likely to focus on transactional factors such as compensation or work-life balance, which are horizontal solutions. So one of the key things is helping your organization, or maybe even you all in your learning and development roles, to identify which problems that you are working towards solving are horizontal and which are vertical, and then looking for solutions that are appropriate for that kind of problem. I know it's easy to kind of fall back onto so things we've done for a lot of years, but the key is those are not necessarily solving the problems that we're facing these days. So here's my little plug for coaching. We think coaching facilitates vertical development. It gives you an opportunity, it gives the leader an opportunity to explore some of their internal thinking and positioning and mindsets. It gives them an opportunity to update those mental models into something that works a little more successfully these days. Gives an opportunity to them to be challenged by someone else who's sort of a neutral champion for them. And they're more willing to take those challenges in that intimate coaching relationship than they might be, say, from their manager. It helps them create more successful relationships and change that interaction to be more curious and supportive than demanding. It can help them actually apply the skill sets they're learning. So back in the day when I was a front of the room trainer and teaching leadership skills, and we used to have a debriefing a session with that, and we called it head, heart, home. Head, do you understand it? Heart, how bought into it are you? And then home, how are you going to apply this once you get back to work? And we would find that we would spend most of the time on the home discussion because everyone would be like, will it work in this situation? What about this situation? Why have this person? I don't know. I tried this with this person and it didn't work. And the conversation would really be very specific to that individual's situation. And coaching allows that conversation, on a very regular cadence. So it's customized to the individual, and they have opportunity to have a sounding board, a thinking partner to discuss, what is the best application in this particular situation. And, way back then, even in the 90s, we were talking about, oh my gosh, how can we have follow-on activities that help participants apply what they learned in their training courses? And you can see today we're still talking about that in this way, really adding coaching as an opportunity, but also looking for other ways to utilize the sets of skills you learn in your horizontal development for vertical purposes. All right, I think I'm going to stop right there and see what questions you have. And Wanika's going to help us through the Q&A.
I sure am. And Lori, it looks like there is a question that came in from Carolyn, who says, I see more of a coaching type of performance management. What are your thoughts? Coaching sessions are held monthly rather than a yearly review.
Okay. Well, I have a mixed view on that. So one, the monthly cadence is fantastic. So talking about performance only once a year, all of you know that's probably not that valuable. So talking about performance on a regular basis and giving employees an opportunity to improve their performance, I think is fantastic. Is that called coaching? I don't think so. We think of coaching as more a neutral kind of thing, because in this case, there's a power differential between the manager and the employee. And so it's not neutral. The manager has an agenda for the coachee. And so they can use coaching skills to create a much better conversation. But are they a coach to that employee? No, they're still a manager to that employee. Wanika, you're smiling. Do you agree with that?
I agree 100% with that, Lori.
Yeah. Yeah, we just call it coaching skills for managers. We don't call managers coaches of employees. Yeah.
And there is a very big difference between the two. So thank you for clarifying that. Lori, what would you say is the right mix of vertical and horizontal development?
So interesting question, because that's going to depend on the individual, or maybe on the sets of leaders that you are developing, because it is very specific to an individual. But I would say it's relatively balanced, because if you think back to that triangle idea, the base has to be developing at the same times as the upward axis. So, if you want to look at it very numerically, it's like 50-50, but it's going to be different per individual, and it's going to be different for leaders across their career. So earlier in their career, more horizontal development. Later in their career, more vertical development.
And what are your thoughts around peer-to-peer coaching?
I love the concept of peer-to-peer coaching. The only thing is that if that peer is actually telling or giving advice versus coaching, then that can go badly really quickly. And you can literally have multiple people going in the wrong direction as a result of that. So I like peer-to-peer coaching. I like it facilitated better. So a small group of peers, maybe with one coach, that makes sure that it's developmentally and internally focused versus advice giving.
Thank you for that. And Kristen, thank you for sharing that question with us. We have another question from Carrie, who would like to know, do you think an organization can go overboard on performance management?
Oh, 100%. Yes, they can. Yes, they can. And talk about transactional, if you are only focused on performance and none of the other more human, more interactive qualities and abilities, people start to just feel like cogs in the wheel. And these days, in the past, I think that was more acceptable when we're more in an industrial style situation. But these days, especially with younger generations, there's been a lot of research that shows purpose and impact is really important to them. So I think only performance or going overboard with performance can be detrimental to the company culture and connection. Right? Then you're only measuring people on what they do, not on what they bring or who they are or how they contribute to the organization in addition to work outcomes.
And of course, there are lots of comments coming in that are saying, thank you for the great advice. And they're loving the information that you are providing. And Tyler just said, horizontal makes me think of management, whereas vertical makes me think of leadership.
Yes, absolutely. Because horizontal, you're actually developing management skills, right? It's how to manage, it's behavioral. But leadership is such a broad category. And even, you can be a very successful, exceptional leader and be a very different style from another exceptional leader. Like one of the things that happened back in the last century is there was all these books that came out with like, to be a good leader, you have to be these three things. And that didn't take into account style diversity, gender diversity, ethnic diversity. It was just based in a, more male probably dominated thinking, because that's what the workforce was back then. And now it's well known that you can be an exceptional leader, and it can look very different from person to person, company to company.
I completely agree. I think it also didn't take into account a person's individual personal experiences they may have had.
Right, right. Like there was this whole phase when everyone thought you had to be a charismatic leader, and people who are more introverted, like, oh, they can't be leaders. Then it kind of flipped the other way. You have to be a metric driven leader. That's the only way to be successful. Like, no, there's a whole lot of ways to be successful. And the key is more in this vertical development. How do you bring to bear all that you have, everything you're coming to this moment in time with, to create the best outcome for the organization and the people in the organization, with everything you've got, not just one way to be. Yeah, I love this old quote. It was actually this guy, James Carville. He was like Clinton's campaign advisor, like way back in the day. But he said this quote I like. It was, you pay me for my mind, I throw in my heart for free. So if you want employees to throw in their hearts, then you have to accommodate all of who they are in helping them achieve their most successful form of leadership.
I love that. That's such a great quote. Andrea provided a comment and a question for you. Andrea says, I come from an organization that doesn't want to hold leadership accountable. How would you recommend working to change this?
Well, that is a tough one, but I would suggest a couple of different things, like trying to get the ear of who you think is the most impactful leader in the organization, whether that's the CEO or somebody else, and kind of partnering with them to try to shift the leadership culture a bit. Another thing you can do is start to outline some of the impacts of the current leadership situation that's going on, with some suggestions around how to improve that situation. Because if you just go to, say, your C-suite folks and you say leadership is not accountable, they're probably not going to want to hear it in that language in that way. So you're going to have to kind of position it in a way that's going to be strategic for the organization. And it can be done. I've seen it happen over, probably seen maybe, probably 200, 250 organizations over my career. And I have seen a lot of organizations shift dramatically. Even really, really large ones have been able to shift dramatically. But it takes sort of like a little core of people who understand what needs to happen. And it's like dropping the rock in the pond, and then it starts to ripple out, ripple out, ripple out, ripple out. And it's a much more organic way of changing things than sort of the very direct way, which doesn't always work when you're going upward in the organization.
Lori, how can leaders help support the vertical development within their own organization?
Oh, that's a fantastic question, whoever asked that. Yes, because leaders can do that on a daily basis. And one of the easiest questions I always ask is, how are you thinking about that? I ask that as a coach. I ask that as a leader in my own organization, because I don't just want the solution. I want to know how they got to that solution. It's kind of like back when you were in school and you got the answer right in math, and they were like, no, you don't get any points because you didn't show your work. Why did they want you to see your work? Because they want to see what was the thought process you went through to get there. So one of the best ways to help people in a vertical way is identify their thinking. And then it lets you be, so you thought of it like this way. What about this other way? What about this possible impact? How did you think about that? And you just literally help them develop their thinking. You can even ask questions like, what model are you applying to this? Or what makes you think this is the right solution? What went into this decision that makes you think you hit it on the head? So asking questions to get inside their head, and then you have a way to adjust that as needed or desired.
And of course, as a coach, I love to talk about all things coaching, and I know you appreciate the value of coaching. But are there other ways to facilitate vertical development other than coaching?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there's lots of ways. There's even training functions can do that if it's in a more interactive way. I think there's some introspective activities that can be offered or suggested that help people identify their own internal thinking. Because one thing that's very interesting, sometimes when I ask people how are they thinking about that, they don't know, because I just haven't observed themselves. So some self-observational practices can be really useful. Having people show their work can be really useful. Just like, hey, what are the factors you considered in getting to that decision? How did you weight them? Why did you weight this more than other? So some of those conversations can be helpful. And then, like I mentioned before, the mentoring can be helpful. And then I really like these alignment conversations. Like one way to start to identify that is to know if you and your employees or your employees and your managers are thinking similarly. And if there's a gap in thinking, then it gives you some information around which party needs to develop a bit on the vertical scale.
And we have time for one last question. Do both group coaching and one-on-one coaching have the same impact for vertical development?
I think one-on-one has more impact because it's very specific to that individual. So I would say group probably has a little bit less, but group has another benefit, which is sometimes people develop their thinking because they hear other thinking from other people. So I think the peer learning aspect of the group coaching is super valuable. It's maybe not as specific to one individual's situation, but because it opens the window to broader thinking and broader maybe understanding across an organization, I think it has it's sort of like a plus on one side and a plus on the other side. They're a little different. I think they both have pretty good impact, actually.
Of course. And I love the question that you left us with earlier to support us and be able to identify thinking. How are you thinking about that? And Walter even dropped into the chat as well that Walter loves. I like, how do you feel about that? So, in addition to how are you thinking about that, how do you feel about that?
Yeah.
So, thank you so much. This has been an incredible presentation, and we greatly appreciate you, Lori, for taking the time and sharing with us today. With that being said, just a reminder to HCI members, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. While you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications, virtual conferences, premium membership, and more. I'd like to say one more thank you to our presenter today and to the good people at Sounding Board. And I'd like to also thank you, our webcast viewer. Thanks for spending an hour with us. We'll see you next time.